Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Unauthorized Disclosure Podcast. I'm Kevin Gastola, and I'm very pleased to be joined for this episode by David Beito, who is an author of New Deal's War, the New Deal's War on the Bill of Rights, the untold story of FDR's concentration camps, censorship, and mass surveillance. He's also a research fellow at the Independent Institute and a professor emeritus at the University of Alabama. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
And so let's begin broadly, as I like to do when I'm speaking to somebody for the first time, and allow you to give any kind of an introduction that you might want to your work, but also to describe what made you want to write this book. Obviously, anybody who's ever worked on any books understands that you get to choose your projects. If hopefully you get to choose your projects, and you're working on doing this history. It's a very richly detailed, comprehensive, thorough history from the era of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and then some of the time before, so we can understand what is happening with attacks on civil liberties during that time. What attracted you to doing this project?
Well, I've done a lot of research on that particular period. And at the edges, I've always been interested in political history, history of American presidents, that kind of history. And around the edges, I saw things that maybe painted a bit of a different picture of Franklin Roosevelt than the picture which is a generally positive one that you get. I mean, my colleagues in the history department and history profession, when they do presidential rankings, he's up there. 1, 2, top 5 always, just about always, unless you're some oddball like me, maybe. So he's highly ranked, he's highly regarded, and I don't think people have really looked closely at one aspect of his record that we are familiar with in one way, and that's Japanese internment. But that tends to be portrayed as an aberration, as an exception, as something in the heat of the moment. And as I looked more and more into it, I saw that it is not an exception. It's like if you look at FDR's civil liberties record, you could say it's like a giant puzzle, right? And you've got many pieces. And the biggest pieces that dominates the board is Japanese internment, but it is still one of many pieces. So I saw how that all fits together. It just sort of came together. And it was a project that I regretted at many times, because when I try to do a project, like I did a biography of a civil rights leader, I try to do the primary research. I try to track down leads. I don't trust secondary sources. I trust them in some sense, but I try to track down what they cite. And this one looks at looks at radio, it looks at civil rights, it looks at Japanese internment, it looks at a wide range of things over a fairly long period. It may not seem long, but it certainly was to me. And I wanted to give it up repeatedly, because I said this is overwhelming. I got a whole bookshelf full of primary documents, because I do the old-fashioned way. I copy them, and they're all there because they're easier for me to use that way. And I said, this is out of control. And went to my wife, I really think I better give this thing up, cut my losses. And she said, keep going. And I did. But it was kind of overwhelming, because it's just a rich literature about FDR. I mean, I could keep going forever reading the literature on him. And certainly if you look at the second primary research, it's a lot. But it turned out to be intellectually challenging, very interesting. I found a lot of things I didn't know before. So it was a rewarding project, I think, although it took me 15 years. Thereabout.
That comes through, and you write in the the introduction how much time was spent, and I can tell that you considered all of the areas from this era, and particularly in relation to Franklin Delano Roosevelt carefully. One of the things that you write is that FDR repeatedly operated under the assumption that the desired end was more important than the means used to achieve it. And that's a nice encapsulation of how you get into some of the issues. So again, as we narrow down into those specific areas, perhaps begin with what you feel is most egregiously omitted in the conversation when we discuss FDR and only discuss the internment camps for Japanese people who were in the United States, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, and it's so many choices. Right now, although this is pre-presidential, I'm doing some research on the Newport sex scandal, which very few people know about, which I'd be happy to talk about. But if we want to move forward to FDR's presidency, a big one that's discussed in the book, again, the title is The Untold Story of FDR's Concentration Camps. And by the way, he called them that. That's not me making that up. He called them concentration camps as late as 1944. Censorship, and then mass surveillance. And I think the mass surveillance is the most striking aspect of this in a way. I came across references to something called the Black Committee when I was reading stuff in the 1950s. I said, what the heck is that? And I went back, and it's named for Senator Hugo Black, who, from Alabama, where I am now, law school is named after him. And Black, of course, is best known because he was on the Supreme Court. But before that, he was a very powerful U.S. senator, very loyal to Roosevelt, kind of a Huey Long kind of vibe about him. If you listen to one of his early speeches as senator, it's like guys like out of pounding tables and, really exuberant and so forth. But that part of his career is not looked at. Well, okay, 1935, Roosevelt's been president 2 years, and his New Deal is in trouble. It's being struck down by the Supreme Court, and he's falling in the polls. Little known fact. His approval ratings are falling. There are polls in early 36 that show him losing. I'm talking about credible polls. So they're worried about it. So Roosevelt, who had had this massive support, was worried about losing it, so he wants to investigate political opposition. And the way they do it was they set up a committee to investigate lobbies. What's a lobby? A lobbying. Well, it's broad as you can make it. It includes indirect lobbying. And that would be our conversation, for example, trying in some way having an effect on public discourse, right? Public opinion. And so it's very broad. So Black starts calling in these sort of critics of the administration, and some of it he has kind of I guess you could say, some grievance because there was some scandalous stuff going on and so forth. But he's looking into this, and he's expanding it, and it's included a lot of people. It's sort of out of control. But he brings in these witnesses, and they push back. And he, it's sort of like, okay, he pushes, they push back, nothing much happens. And then someone comes up with the bright idea of, let's say we could get the private communications of these people. And then, hit him with it. So Black says, fine. What is the best kind of private communication to get? Telegrams. We often forget the parallels between telegrams and emails and text messages. Telegrams are 50% of long-distance communication in the 1930s. They are like emails in many ways. They're often instantaneous. You say things in them that you would not say in letters. A lot of businesses have telegraphers, so they're moving back and forth. They're rapid. They're immediate. And they're all over the place. So if you can get telegrams, that's a big deal. And so here's what they do. He sends his staffers to the telegraph company. The main one is Western Union. It's the big enchilada. And he says to them, here's how they start. Just for starters, we want access to every single telegram sent to every member of Congress through Washington, sent to and from, for a 9-month period. Here's what we want. And Western Union is sort of like, no, we're not going to do that. That customers wouldn't like that, so we don't want to do it. So then Black goes to the administration, and he secures an order through presidential intervention from the FCC, which had jurisdiction. And the FCC says, you cooperate with Senator Black, give him what he wants. And the FCC and Western Union sort of says, we don't like this, but they go along with it. So Black staffers come in there, and they start searching through big boxes full of originals. Here's the way I should have backed up a little bit. There was a law that required the telegraph companies to keep all originals of the telegrams. Right. So they go in there and they start saying, well, we want Senator such and such. We want to look there. And they, for this 9-month period, they start looking through them. And Blacks gives orders that, well, if you see things of a personal nature, avert your eyes. Look for only things related to lobbying, which would be, again, any attempt to influence the political climate, not just particular legislation. And they go through thousands and thousands and thousands. They keep going. And guess what? It adds up to over 3 million. Yes, that's mass surveillance. And they copy some. They take notes of them. You can see the copies of these telegrams in the National Archives, in the archives of the committee. And, they'll pull them out. So imagine someone pulling out your text messages, your email, and they ambush witnesses quite effectively. Well, this is like nobody knows this is going on. But then Western Union gets the bright idea they're going to start informing people, because what happened was they do this initial search and they say, well, why don't we target this person and who's in Wichita, or this person, let's get their telegrams on an individual basis. No subpoena, by the way, right? And so they start doing that. They start informing people your telegrams are being searched by the Black Committee. One of the people they inform is Newton Baker. Newton Baker had been Secretary of War under Wilson. He was a kind of a moderate New Dealer. He was mentioned heavily as a presidential candidate, Democrat, 1932. Kind of mild-mannered, kind of a moderate, like I said. And Baker is so mad when he finds this out. He said, if I saw somebody, a lynching party, trying to lynch Senator Black, I would not join the lynching. However, if I saw them putting a rope around his neck, I would not stop them. So you get him. Okay, and then you get a guy named Silas Strawn. And you're pissing off big time here. Strawn was, here's all of his things. He's head, I don't know if he was all at the same time, but I think he might have been. He was head of the American Chamber of Commerce, the American Bar Association, the Republican Finance Committee, and just for, icing on the cake, the American Golf Association. He's head of all these things, and he is also a lawyer, the founder of a prominent Chicago law firm that's still with us called Winston Strawn. I think it was called that then. But anyway, he's one of the partners in that, still around. And so he's got the wherewithal and the motivation and the knowledge, and he sues. Violation of Fifth Amendment, Fourth Amendment, all, right to privacy. In fact, that term is used long before Roe v. Wade. They're using the term like right of privacy. And they're saying search and seizure is violating all these rights. And he wins. The court, it's a district court, says, Senator Black, we would force you to give back this stuff, but we have limited power. However, we prohibit you from doing any more searches. And Black is mad. He says these judges are out of control, that kind of thing. Sounds like a conservative in some ways. And then he says, but I got what I need. And he does. He's got millions of telegrams. So, but it's a precedent. It's a precedent that stops, I think, future congressional committees from doing stuff like that. And it backfires. I mean, it's condemned. I'm talking about people, when I grew up, these Democrats were still around, some of them like Emanuel Seller. I kind of thought they're just like standard hacks. John McCormick, who ended up being second in line to the presidency after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. These are like standard Democrats. They're comparing this to Mussolini. So Mussolini does stuff like this. So what that is interesting, the way it was condemned by what you would call today the mainstream press, condemned by a lot of people in the American Civil Liberties Union. And this is a left-right coalition. And I see that cropping up for civil liberties. So I'm going on, but it's hard. It takes long to explain because I wasn't aware of this, and it's kind of complicated. But when you use that term mass surveillance, you immediately think of Herbert or of J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover's kind of he's not that important a guy in the book, really. He's later. There's other stuff going on that's a lot bigger in some ways. I mean, at any one time, Hoover does something like, I don't know, 150 taps, black bag cases. Some of them are extra legal and things, but it's not this scale, surprisingly. Hoover's a cop. He's not quite this. He's not an ideologue, and this is being driven by ideology, I think, to a great extent.
But what you say about telegrams is important, and it's worth making the point explicitly, or at least expressing my view about it, that when I read that story in your book, when I see that they're taking, as you say, 3 million private telegrams, it's hard not to think of what happened a little more than a decade ago when people were digging into the stories of NSA mass surveillance and getting a glimpse of how easy it was for various U.S. government agencies to collect both private and, I assume you could call some of it, public data. But the parallels here, just seeing this mass surveillance that exists, another aspect of this era is recognizing the ability of the government, the power that was claimed to go after people with either anti-sedition laws or the Espionage Act. So I wanted to ask you in particular, because this falls in with something of my particular interest, is this revoking of second-class mailing status for select publications. There is a part of your book that deals with this in Franklin Delano Roosevelt's history. Would you get into that?
Yeah. On your point, when I started this 15 years ago, I was like, boy, you nailed it, Beito. For once in my life, because this stuff is all coming back. It was gone. Sedition trials, that was gone. Fake news, all that. This has all been done before. Okay, now, on the whole revoking of mailing rights, this is an interesting issue. People often, if you look at discussion of civil liberty during World War II, historians often say, basically, well, that Japanese internment, that was a bad thing. Really bad. But really, otherwise, it wasn't so bad in terms of civil liberties if you compare it to World War I. Well, not so fast. What you see in World War II is there's some interesting differences. One, you have one similarity. I think you have a president who is not friendly to civil liberties. In fact, I think Roosevelt's attitude is worse than Wilson's, because what you see with Wilson is quite interesting. Is his Department of Justice will be prosecuting somebody, and he'll actually intercede for them occasionally and say, "Do you really have to go after this guy? He's kind of an old-time liberal." And the Attorney General says, "Yes, I do, Mr. President." And he says, "Okay." So Wilson defers. He's got a kind of a conscience about it. Now, what FDR is doing is he's saying, I want you to, my Attorney General, Francis Biddle, I want you to go after this person, this person, this person. He wants Biddle to go further than Biddle wants to go. Big difference. Okay, what is the situation that's different here? Why don't you have the same scale? Well, it's a different animal. After Pearl Harbor, just about everybody rallies to the war effort. In fact, when they have a sedition trial, I can go through the list of defendants. A good portion of them supported the war, right? So, opposition to the war evaporates. So you've got, if you're, World War I is different because you have a lot of people continue to oppose the war. So you have a lot of potential targets, right? In World War II, you have very few potential targets if your standard is opposition to the war, obstruction of the war effort, that kind of thing. Very few. So you've got a sea with very few fish. You've got the same nets, right? But the number of fish has gone down. That's one way to look at it. So Roosevelt wants to go further because he wants Biddle to go after the publishers, for example, of the Patterson-McCormick Axis, as he calls them. These are cousins who publish the biggest newspapers in the country. Chicago Daily Tribune, millions of subscribers. New York Daily News, and Washington Times Herald, run by these cousins, basically. One of them, Sissy Patterson in Washington, and her brother, Joe, in New York. He wants to go after these people. Who'd all, by the way, 2 out of the 3 had been political allies of his and had supported him in 1940. The Pattersons had. But he wants to go after them because they turned against him because of Lend-Lease. But Biddle says, basically, I can't find any way to go after them. They all said they support the war effort now. I don't see anything here, Mr. President. He wants to go after them, but there's a break. So this is a story here that's interesting because there's a civil libertarian consciousness that has seeped into the Justice Department. They are obstructing the administration. They had learned some of the lessons, at least from World War I. They've been taught by people like their lawyer, Zachariah Chafee, right? Big civil libertarian, big Harvard civil libertarian lawyer. They imbibed that stuff, and they frustrated him. So in a way, this is deep state. This is a deep state stopping Roosevelt, in a way. A civil libertarian deep state. Interesting. I don't know if I'd go too far with that, but they're obstructing him. So they hold him off. But they do go after some people. But there aren't many to go after. And they find some kind of Nazi publications, quasi-Nazi, and they go after them. It's a handful. And they basically, Father Coughlin, his paper is shut down. He probably would have been prosecuted, but Roosevelt is able to pull some wires and get the Catholic cardinal to stop him, to order him to stop. But there are a couple interesting publications that are targeted. And they both have some things in common. One of them is the Militant, which is the publication of the Socialist Workers' Party. They're Trotskyites. They are Marxists. They're standard Marxists. And they believe the war is just the capitalists killing each other and we should stay out. But they don't really do anything, right, to obstruct the war. In fact, a lot of them serve in the military. But the communists don't like them. So the communists are very supportive of prosecuting the Trotskyites, big time. And they are prosecuted for sedition. And the Militant is also separately, has its mailing rights revoked, its second-class mailing rights. The other one is quite interesting. And, like I said, there aren't many. But why are they targeted? Because they're still opposing the war, I think is a big part of it, right? Another publication that's like, why are you going after this publication? It's called, one of my favorite little publications, called the Boise Valley Herald. This is not in Boise, Idaho, but in Middleton, small town newspaper that reports weddings and funerals and that kind of thing. And they go after them. They revoke their mailing rights. And I thought, okay, what was this, a Nazi thing? Or no, they're civil libertarian. They're kind of quasi-socialist in a way, kind of quasi-anti-New Deal. Norman Thomas says, I've looked at this publication, sounds fine to me. They are pro-civil rights. They defend Bayard Rustin. They are anti-Japanese internment. These are interesting people. And this is an old guy that runs it, but they are kind of quasi-pacifist. And their view of the war is, well, we don't, they after Pearl Harbor said this is unnecessary. We provoked Japan. We need to negotiate an end to the war. Okay, you can disagree with that, but it's a position they had. And people, ACLU defends them. And they look into it because they are these Nazis or something. No, there's no evidence. Are they anti-Semitic? No, there's no evidence. So they're comfortable defending them, and they have their mailing rights revoked because they continue to oppose the war, but in a kind of philosophical way. But they also say maybe we need to negotiate a peace treaty. They criticize the conduct of the war effort, and that's enough. And in fact, Biddle basically says that's the reason, and it's really quite amazing. So there aren't many, but it's because there are fewer targets, I think, is the reason, right? You got to go out, you got to dig deep, because the Justice Department's going to fight back if you try to go after pre-war non-interventionists who all rallied to the war effort. Now, you could say they're insincere or whatever, but they've gone on record for it.
And then another chunk of the book deals with an aspect of mass media that for a lot of people today, it's mostly forgotten, and it's the terrain for radio in the United States in this period of history, and how I'll just say as a much younger from a younger generation, that I can honestly say that I don't probably appreciate the manner in which politicians were using radio back then, because we just don't see anything like it today. There's other means for trying to reach, I'll call them voters for lack of a better term. And but yeah, you describe the manner in which Franklin Delano Roosevelt is able to simultaneously monopolize or gain this access to the airwaves without any kind of encumberment, and that at the same time, those shows, those people who are producing content for radio that is deemed to be antagonistic or anti-FDR, well, we could find ways to threaten them where they won't be able to do their radio production any longer. So why don't you get into that part of your discussion of FDR's history?
Well, FDR is a master of radio. I mean, the man is the right time, the right place, the right kind of character. He's an aristocrat. He's charming. He is absolutely the right guy to be in charge if he wants to get results. Because people that find that appealing, his manner, everything about him. And it is said that his voice, he could have been a very successful radio announcer if he had not been president. And it's true. And there's parallels to Trump that are quite interesting. Remember, Trump years ago, the way he got going was Twitter. And why did he do that? Because it was his way to go around the media and go directly to people. That's what Roosevelt's doing. Same reasons, too. And he does fireside chats, and he does other speeches, and where he goes unfiltered to the public and is able to go around them. Now, Roosevelt is able to use a lot of things. One is there is real fear because they've shortened the license period to 6 months. So even if that power isn't used, it could be used. And a lot of these stations are very worried about it. Initially, when the New Deal comes, they're a little worried about possible nationalization, I think. And they cooperate with the administration. And it's a crisis situation. There's a rally effect. And so they basically to say, Roosevelt, anytime you want to use our radio free, use it. And there are thousands upon thousands of hours from New Dealers, from people in the administration, First Lady, cabinet members. They have their own radio shows and things. Thousands of hours. And those are picked up and picked up for free. Now, There are anti-New Deal people, but they are gradually marginalized. And by 1938, there is not a single anti-New Deal radio commentator on the networks, the big networks. NBC, they got the blue and the red, and then CBS, right? And that's like 90% of listening time. I mean, it's like dominates, right? So there's not one left. There had been one in 38, and that's an interesting story about how he's forced out. There are dissenting voices on radio, but they're hamstrung, and they tend to be these local stations, these regional networks. Father Coughlin is a prominent example who had been a supporter of Roosevelt, turned against him, and what Coughlin is able to do is purchase time. That's how he gets on. But you start to bring in things like a kind of equal time rule. You just put pressure on these stations, and by the end of the 30s, they're dropping Coughlin because it's just too much of a headache. Even though he's willing to pay for his own time, they're dropping him. But he's kind of on these local stations and so forth. So you have that. You do have some voices like that, but on the networks, they're out of the picture through a combination of things. The FCC, the Network Broadcasting Code, which is basically created to accommodate the FCC and works. I mean, it's all very complicated. And you've got this behind the scenes pressure. I could just tell you about the last commentator, what happened to him. His name is Bo Carter. And Bo Carter's kind of an interesting character. I guess a little bit of a populist. He is I forget, I think it's NBC. I forget if it's NBC or CBS. I think it's NBC. And he's like close to the number one radio commentator in the country. Very entertaining. He's on several days a week. And he'd supported Roosevelt. He met with him in 1936. He backed him. But then he turned against him on the court packing, which came in 1937. And the administration basically comes to the conclusion we got to get him off. And Roosevelt lets down his hair to a few people, look for any way to get him. You know, his immigration status, his taxes, get him off the air, silence him. And they eventually do. And they do it through advertisers in the end. Because one of the leading advertisers for the show was a Marjorie Merriweather Post, who may be familiar to those of you who know anything about the history of Mar-a-Lago. She was the original owner. A big, Post serial. Her husband was ambassador to the Soviet Union, kind of an interesting character all by himself. And wrote a book called Mission to Moscow, which became a movie in the 40s. But anyway, they go to her. She's a leading Democratic donor, and she exerts pressure. And Carter is forced to tone it down, and ultimately he's forced off. And that's it. 1938, they're all either pro-New Deal or they just don't discuss political issues.
So, as you said, when you were introducing the work that you've done, he calls it a concentration camp. He uses that word for what is being done to Japanese Americans. And you're very clear that he had this racist ideology within him, and he did hate Japanese people. That was something he learned, it would seem, from his childhood. And yet there are a lot of political minds. There are those who have assessed history. They've come up with this line of thinking that what happened with the camps was somewhat out of FDR's control. Like, it just happened. And I'd like to ask you, as we begin to wind down our conversation, about that, but also as it relates to these other civil liberties issues. And just note that in looking at some of the stuff from your book and doing a little bit of cursory searching, I couldn't help but notice that what I would call progressive media, maybe more left-leaning media, has largely ignored your work, even though it's been richly detailed. If I go and look up your book, what I find, and I'm glad that they gave your book this attention, are libertarian groups, are these institutions that are already openly aligned against Democratic Party politics, which I think speaks to your argument in the book about how much of a darling figure FDR is. I wanted to give you an opportunity, and I also was just curious what your response would be to the blinders that exist around FDR's presidency.
Well, I very much want people on the political left. I want to engage with them. I want to talk about them because I think my research is something they might actually like in some ways, because one of the inspiring things that I came out is there are all these figures on the left that are great civil libertarians, like Norman Thomas, the AOC Bernie Sanders of his time, will defend the civil liberties of everybody. And we have some interesting examples of that. I've tried, and anyone, your listeners that knows opportunities, I've tried to get on. I don't know who to contact. Chris Hayes. I've contacted him. No answers. I've contacted people at NPR and so forth. I've searched podcasts that deal with civil liberties and so forth, and I just haven't had much luck. And I've tried. I tried to get this. I hope it'll get reviewed by the Journal of American History. I pulled some strings. I knew somebody there, and I said, "Hey, could you at least get them to read this?" Right? And she said, "Well, I'll try, but they're probably just going to be turned off. Independent Institute, whatever." I chose them because they were interested in the book. They were going to sell for $20, not $100, and they let me go for it, and I appreciate that.
Last thing that I do want to make sure I get in here before I let you go is the Newport sex scandal.
Yes.
I know nothing about this. I've never heard of this. I open up your book, I'm reading it, and you say you're doing some more work on it now, and I'm glad. But obviously, there's a lot that could be said about this, but just take some time here as we conclude the show to introduce my listeners and the people who watch this show to the Newport sex scandal.
Yeah, I'm looking into it because I'm doing actually I've got some money to do a biography of FDR, which means I'm looking a lot more into the general picture. Okay, well, the Newport sex scandal is worse than I thought, worse than I wrote about. This is in 1918, 1919. Roosevelt is Assistant Secretary of Navy. So he's on a trajectory like his cousin, who was also Assistant Secretary. And there's this guy in Providence at the naval base in Newport, who sees gays in the Navy, and he doesn't like it, and they're having sex, and he doesn't like all this. He hears all these stories, so he starts investigating. And part of his investigation is he personally entraps them. So there are people he's working with who are like having sex with people in the Navy to entrap them. This is like, when I first heard entrapment, what are you talking about? Well, that's what you're talking about. All right, so he goes to Roosevelt because he can't get funding. He wants to expand this investigation. Kind of tolerated. He actually goes to the Attorney General. The Attorney General is no civil libertarian, is not interested in it. And he goes to Roosevelt, who's Assistant Secretary, much liked by the Secretary, although the Secretary and him really have kind of different views. But Roosevelt's a charmer. And he comes to Roosevelt and said, "Could you help me?" And Roosevelt single-handedly keeps this investigation alive and expands it. And he sets up a division called it's called Section A, the official name. And he's the head of it. And it's also called the Newport Sex Squad. And he brings in investigators from the outside, including some of his old Harvard classmates. And they do these same things. Entrap people, use sex, right? All this stuff. And then they put them on this ship, and they hold them without charges, and it's just like out of control. Well, this effort basically gets some pushback because they start doing these dragnets in Newport, and one of the guys arrested is this minister who apparently is just there. He is involved in a sex thing, and a local editor covers this and starts attacking Roosevelt. So you're the guy running this thing. So Roosevelt is immediately confronted by this, and his first reaction is to say, interestingly enough, well, why are you so worried about the methods? Right? The goal here is we all agree on that, and people did pretty much. We don't want gays in the Navy. We all agree on that. Why are you worried about this? And he says this, and then he's pressed on it. He says, well, I didn't know they were doing these things. Right? I didn't know their methods. Not many people believe him, including, I think, a lot of historians who are like pro-Roosevelt. Biography of Eleanor, that guy, it's how much hail just came out a couple of years ago. He doesn't buy it, right? But that's his argument, all right? But then he falls back when they press him on it, and he says, well, aren't we worried about, why are we worried about methods? He used the term methods. We got results here. Okay, so they do this, and it's like, ends up being kind of controversial, believe it or not. This is not a gay-friendly era. And so the Senate opens an investigation, and they finally publish a report in 1921, and it's headline news in the New York Times. They blame the abuses on FDR. FDR to blame, New York headlines. They're saying this guy ran this thing. He tolerated all this. This is un-American. I mean, they really just, the methods, right, were just out of control, and he's condemned by a Senate committee, all right? And FDR is again, in panic mode, but he comes back to this whole thing. I didn't know, and, why are we worried about this and all this? And he is, exhausted, and people are thinking that his political career is ruined. But it happens less than a month after the Senate report, polio. FDR is hit by polio. And I didn't know this at the time I wrote about it, but guess what? I'm tracking down more information about this. This is from the book about Eleanor, mainstream book. He blamed it on the Senate committee. He said, look, and he might have been right. It seems like it was contaminated water, but he also had a lower immunity. And, of course, that could be caused by stress. And he had plenty of stress. So he blamed his polio on the Senate committee. And I'm digging more into that and see what he specifics say. And, this lays him up for a long time. And in many ways, it's an inspiring story. I mean, there are positive things about FDR, and that's one of them. I couldn't have probably lasted under those circumstances. But it doesn't sink his career, and I'm not sure why. But what the end result of the investigation was the following. The Navy basically, to these investigators, they say, we can't do anything about you because you were acting with good intentions. Yeah, you had sex with all these people and stuff, but we kind of were at fault. We gave you the wrong thing and agenda. We're not going to punish you. However, those that were found guilty under the investigation had their benefits revoked. They didn't get Navy funerals, for example. They were dishonorably discharged from the service. Their lives were ruined. But the Newport sex scandal, perhaps because it does involve gays, and most Americans were like, okay. It just, if you go to the newspaper, it's big news, 1921, then there's a long period, 20 years, nobody's talking about it. So it really drops off. It's covered, though, by the more detailed FDR biographies. It is in there, but people skirt over it. But it's just horrible. And it's just horrible. And it's an attitude that comes later. And this is what FDR's Attorney General said regarding the internment. Biddle. He didn't care much about procedure. He wanted results. So that's a consistent thread. So I did say
All
one
right,
good thing
Dave.
about FDR, but that's about all I come up with there right on the moment.
All right.
So, okay.
Thank you for coming on the show. Is there a particular place that people should go for the book, or just wherever you go get your books, like Amazon is good?
Amazon, or you can go to independent.org. Again, it's not too expensive. And if any of podcasters is sitting out there and think this guy's full of hot air, we'll get you a book and you can read it. And, you know, I'd love to talk to you. So that's just an invitation. And yeah, I hope people take me up on it. And thank you for the opportunity.
I hope that other shows take you up on the offer as well. You kindly sent me a copy of the book to go through so I could uh, ask relevant questions today, not just, ones like, how does this parallel to Joe Biden, that, leave you grasping for straws and trying to figure out what specifically I might be thinking of.
Yeah,
But
people haven't read it, come up with some questions that like, but I didn't talk about that, but I'll try to somehow talk about that, that kind of thing.
All right. Thank you, David, and good luck to you.
Okay, thank you.